Hello there, product people. Welcome to the show that supercharges your abilities to become better thinkers, makers, and leaders. I'm your host, Alsawi, and I'm thrilled to have you join me for this exciting episode of Product People. In this episode, we'll explore the journey of tech for Palestine and discuss the significance of ethics in technology. We'll investigate examples of technology use that has gone wrong, as well as examples where tech has been used for good. We'll also chat about the attention economy and explore how problem solving can serve as a coping mechanism. Furthermore, we'll discuss the impact of startups and social media platforms on individuals, communities, and societies, then touch on some of the challenges we're facing in the West and strategies for making a meaningful difference toward a more just world. So if you're in tech, product, or simply someone with a moral conscience looking to understand how to make the world better, you're in the right place. As always, you can expect an open conversation, valuable insights, and meaningful advice that can fuel your own journey with product, design, and leadership. Let's dive right in. Today, I'm joined by a tech leader, successful founder, and community builder. He leads Tech for Palestine, a collaboration of tech projects advocating for Palestine. At its core, Tech for Palestine is an incubator to start and support projects with mentorship, tech volunteers, marketing, and connections to the broad Palestine advocacy community. He previously founded tech startups like Darklang and Circle CI, as well as a Y Combinator-backed startup. He graduated with a PhD in computer science from Trinity College Dublin in 2010. My guest enjoys pastries and chocolate, especially when they're combined in a chocolate croissant. He typically holds his meetings at the Hot Chocolate Cafe in New York City and is a huge fan of board games. Without further ado, let's welcome Paul Biggar to the Product People podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to know if you can take us through your journey in the tech industry. How did it begin and how is it going?
Yeah, I think it's fairly regular tech founder story. Did a degree in computer science, read a lot of Paul Graham on the way, moved to San Francisco, did startups, got, I suppose where it starts to get a little bit off track is got very disillusioned with tech after a number of years towards the 2017, 18 kind of time, and decided to leave San Francisco to get a little bit away from tech, and then the complete, not quite separation from tech, but finishing my disillusion in tech is this moving towards Palestine advocacy, although within tech, I suppose.
Tell me more about that. What happened around that time period where you labeled it as the disillusion with tech?
I arrived in tech in 2010, 2011, finished my PhD just in time for the start of this, of the 2009 to 2021 tech cycle. And so I was just like fully in. I was a believer, I went to the parties, I met the people, idolized some of the people, did Y Combinator, and just over the years, things just started to be a little bit out of place. And I think one of the first ones was where the gig economy started taking off, and just these companies were hailed as, like, I think in particular Uber was hailed as this like amazing company that that grew so fast. I'm kind of looking at like, well, this gig economy thing, that's not good. And you can sort of there's a bunch of things that are associated with that. So, like, for example, when DoorDash started stealing tips, and I think Instacart did this as well. They stole tips from the gig economy workers that they had, and then they put in that proposition in California that made it that sort of codified in the Constitution a second-class citizen. And along the time that this was going, there was a lot of other problems. I mean, Meta, or it was Facebook at the time, was really doing quite a lot of problematic stuff with in particular the what we might call the attention economy. I feel that a lot of us have our brains actually damaged by social media, by these sort of like quick adrenaline thing. I know lots of people who can't read books anymore because they've lost the ability to actually focus for that length of time. And then tech also had its Me Too moments where a lot of people were saying really problematic things. And while at one point there was sort of one sort of like crazy off to the side investor, which was Peter Thiel, that started becoming much more of a movement movement around 2016, around the time of Trump. Obviously, Peter Thiel personally put money into Trump, but there's a sort of like a movement around it where having values was just not a necessary part of having a company. And I was part of Y Combinator, which I had like very good opinions of early on, and then I saw kind of Y Combinator founders having the same kind of views. And I remember sitting at a Y Combinator demo day, and I was looking out, and it's just like this is all men. All right, where are the women? And it's like I don't know, 5-10% women. It's a very very small number of women, very small number of Black founders. I don't think almost no Latinx founders, Native founders, and the Black founders were rarely American. They were sort of the brought in from these are the sort of the cream of the crop of Africa, as opposed to representative of America. And so it was just social justice was becoming part of the zeitgeist. I was learning, and I just felt that like tech was really kind of, I don't know if behind was the word, but willfully not participating. And then when Black Lives Matter happened, and I think tech's response, there was a lot of right wing claims made about the Black Lives Matter movement. Carry on a couple of years, there was, and this was the final straw for me. I actually got kicked out of Y Combinator, and the reason I got kicked out was because I posted on Twitter that twice Y Combinator founders had posted about how to skip the lines for vaccine. And you might remember at the time, vaccines were very scarce. They were being allocated in a, let's call it a social justice manner, where the most affected communities were being given vaccines first. And it seemed to me, and I think it seemed to a lot of the world, that it was incredibly unethical to be skipping the line. And so to see people post within the Y Combinator forums, this is how you do it, this is how I went, it just seemed kind of the nail of the coffin for my association with tech. And so that was before Israel invaded Gaza, before it began a genocide. And so this is, so 2 years later that happened, and I'm on Twitter. I'm still, 1 foot in tech, I suppose, in a way. But I'd moved away from San Francisco for this purpose, to sort of like be further from tech, not have 100% of my life in tech, maybe 20% of my life. But I was still doing a startup, still had investors, all that sort of thing. And, I started seeing these investors posting for Israel, and posting what was very obvious propaganda. It was very clear that there was a point in November where the talking point was anti-Semitism at Columbia. And, I could clearly see, oh, well, right across the range of Twitter, including my investors, this narrative is being put out in I mean, it's just very obvious. Propaganda. It wasn't clear whether it was like they are deliberately jumping on this thing, or whether it was a little more organized than that. And it later came out that it's probably a little more organized than that. But I'm just saying, like, who are these people that I know? And then put it into the sort of Me Too things, the right wing things, the lack of equity in tech, the gig economy stuff. It just all sort of added up as like, oh, like this is really bad. These are people who are actively, taking part. I don't know if your audience will know the phrase manufacturing consent, but it's kind of this concept that large parts of society sort of like work together, in particular the media and politics, to create consent for something that's very bad. And it was in particular used for what the New York Times did during the Iraq War, to sort of manufacture consent for the Iraq War, with these stories that were not true about weapons of mass destruction. And then it's exactly the same thing. It's happening on Twitter in front of me. They're manufacturing consent for the invasion of Gaza, for the genocide. And some of the things I saw people say were just utterly shocking to me. One of my investors, Matt Ocko, called for collective punishment. And he said, and I think that this is a direct quote, it's not collective punishment when they're all in on it. And I was just like, how could anyone say that about another person? And this guy, Matt Ocko, he's the one of the partners at Data Collective, which is a pretty respectable venture capital firm. It's not Sequoia, but it's like, I don't know, tier 2. And he's experienced no consequences. No one has called him out for it. It's, I mean, apart from me, I suppose. And he got called out on I suppose some people on Team Palestine called him out for it, but no one in the venture capital community has said, "Hey, listen, that's not okay. You can't be saying that."
A lot of what happened throughout your story, at least in the last decade or so, I think was around the people running tech. You know, a combination of things. Some of it was this lack of moral compass or a sense of values and lack of accountability that you mentioned, and
Yeah.
perhaps a set of agendas that maybe you didn't think were in play.
I think that's right. I think there was also like a large amount of naivety. I think that, kind of people went into it with the idea that we're going to make the world a better place, or, the Y Combinator mantra, make something people want. And it's just, there was there was nothing really beyond that. There was, I've never, in my entire time in San Francisco, there was no discussion from leaders about ethical tech or about, what are the limits on what you should build. And I mean, I think that the gig economy was a really important change in tech, where there's this thing which is, it's clearly wrong to have this, second class citizen group, and it was brought in as this, well, people can make extra money on the side, and everyone, all the people who were saying that, this is going to go wrong in this way, and it went wrong in exactly the way that
Mm-mm.
people said it would. But the people who were making money on it were just like, well, Uber is such a great company, and we're providing people jobs, and and of course at the same time they were actively building AI for cars so that they could kill the same jobs. So there was, I think it was definitely a lot of people who didn't have a moral compass, and whose moral compass was money or success or growth. The only thing that mattered in tech in that period was how fast your growth was, and nothing else mattered, and you were dog shit if your growth wasn't fast. So
Yeah, that mantra is interesting. Make something people want, because it's loaded with questions around it. Who are the people? And does it mean that if it's something that people either truly want or we think they want, does it mean it's actually a good thing? So
yeah.
in itself, it sounds nice, but I guess if you kind of unpack it a little bit and think through it, it can definitely go wrong. And from your examples, we can see how.
Well, it's gone even wronger. So Y Combinator now invests in companies that make cruise missiles. I feel the somewhat inevitable conclusion of how tech has been going, it's only gotten worse in the last couple of years. I'm not even talking about AI. There's this phrase that you might have heard, American dynamism, which is basically, pivoting tech into the defense industry and being part of what I think would not be unfair to call American imperialism, right? Becoming part of building the tools that America uses to maintain its sort of like global dominance. But yeah, Y Combinator makes cruise missiles now, and it's like, yeah, you're making something people want, and what some people want is cruise missiles.
Yeah, how do you think they're going to use it? So I mean,
And
that's a
they're,
very
they're gonna
yeah, they're going to blow people up with it. I mean, it's not necessarily something that you gift someone on an occasion.
Merry Christmas! I got you a cruise missile.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so I mean, wow, I've been taking notes and I can go in so many directions, but I want to go back to Palestine. Your connection with the Palestinian cause, and how did Tech for Palestine start?
I suppose I took the story to October, November 2023. The invasion of Gaza had started, and it was already clear that the civilian casualties were out of control, and that Israel was, directly targeting civilians. And I think 20,000 people had died at around this point in sort of November. And the tech was cheering Israel on, as I could see it. They were supporting it, they were manufacturing consent. And I was seeing my Twitter feed was literally tech people saying, go Israel, or dehumanizing things about Palestinians. And it was interspersed with like children whose arms were blown off, and like parents carrying dead children covered in dust, that sort of thing. And things that were extremely clear atrocities and war crimes. And it shocked that juxtaposition of seeing the two of them was really shocking. And so I got into a deep depression about this. I couldn't turn off Twitter. I couldn't look away from what was happening. And I was thinking, well, this is the Holocaust of our time. This is the sort of state-sponsored genocide, and we have to do something about this, and what are we supposed to do? And I felt really powerless. I felt like I had no ability to do anything about it. And so I reflected, like, what am I good at? It's like, well, I can write. That's basically the only thing that I can do. And so I wrote a blog post, and the blog post was called "I Can't Sleep," and it was about the fact that I couldn't sleep. And it was I was brand new to Palestine. I had no connection to it at all. I'd never been to Palestine or Israel or anywhere in the Middle East except a package holiday in Sharm el Sheikh, and I had just no connection to it at all. And I think that's one of the reasons that it blew up, that it was sort of perceived as this sort of authentic message from someone who doesn't have a connection, because Arabs and Muslims are perceived as being biased in some way. And so, frankly, being white is a thing where it's like, my voice carries more in a sense. So this blog post was, it was very, I suppose you call it pro-Palestine or anti-Israel, or anti-genocide, I suppose, called it out for what it was, talked about the history. A lot of things that I hadn't been familiar with, like the Nakba, for example, was, I was not familiar with it. On October 7th, I didn't know I didn't know what the Gaza and the West Bank were as sort of like geographic constructs. I didn't know, like, Palestine is split in two parts, and one of them is blockaded and the other is, being settled. I had some concept of settlements and apartheid, but I didn't really know what it was. And so, I wrote this blog post and it went crazy viral. I've never seen anything, certainly of mine, go like this. And what happened was, just for days afterwards, people started sending me messages, and they were all positive. Just, thank you for saying this. Thank you for saying this. And some of them said, oh, I'm in tech as well, and I can't believe this is happening. And some of them had projects that they were working on. A lot of it was sort of venture capital based, because they had seen what I had seen, that venture capital was taking an active part in this manufacturing consent. And so the ones that were building projects, we sort of got everyone together in a Discord, and then at this point there's about 40 of us in the Discord, and I said, should we open this up, get volunteers? And people were like, yeah, let's do it. And that is what became Tech for Palestine. So we had a Discord, we called it Tech for Palestine. January 2nd this year, we opened it up, and 1,000 people joined in the first day. And the first week, 2,000 people joined. Now we're at about 8,000. And, just sort of like, very, very much a startup in a sense, just hitting these sort of growth before we were ready for it, and trying to figure things out on the ground, and just adapting as what happened, and after a few months of pivoting and trying to see how we could be most helpful, and so on, we eventually realized that what we are is an incubator, and sort of Y Combinator, but for Palestine advocacy.
All right. Another question I had for you was, how specifically do you help projects within the Tech for Palestine incubator?
So there's a number of different ways that we help them, and there's very obvious ones, like we give them volunteers, we help market them, we connect them to the ecosystem. But honestly, the main way that we help them is via mentorship. So I know this is this is a product podcast, and a lot of what we're helping people with is what I would call startup thinking, which I think also you can think of as product thinking. So we talk to people about make sure that you talk to your users, cut down the scope, get an MVP out. What you're looking for is impact. So write down what your goals are, figure out where it is, or what way that you can have impact, make plans, that sort of thing. But it's really where we constantly go is we're telling people, okay, you have this big idea, you have this big vision, cut it down, talk to users, and iterate. And I mean, this is the main startup advice that I gave to startups when, well, I guess I still give startups advice sometimes. But it's the same thing. People have this grand vision for what it is they're going to build, and we say, have you talked to users? And they say, well, no, because I know what I want to build. And we're like, go talk to users. And in some cases, we have to teach them, this especially people who aren't coming from tech, or people who are just a little too myopically focused on the engineering. Actually go talk to users. Here is a process of customer development. Read some Lean Startup, read some Steve Blank, that sort of thing. I know that product has matured greatly since those were the resources, but they're the ones I'm most familiar with. And really kind of get people around the concept of, you don't know what you're building. You have a hypothesis of what you're building, and only by, you know, working to validate that hypothesis, by learning from that, by iterating, you know, that's the process that you're going to use to get to what it is that actually has impact.
You said that you're about 8,000 people now and how you see yourself as an incubator. Any kind of projects to highlight that either came through or are a work in progress?
Yeah, so we're now at about 33 projects, I think.
Okay.
And a project is a long-term thing. So it's not something, you know, we do it for a couple of weeks. You can think of a project as equivalent to a startup. So there's a lot in the boycotting space. One of our probably the most popular app, and it was our first one that we worked with, was Boycat. So that's boy cat, as in a male child feline. That's an app that you can use to scan your groceries and know if any of the companies that you're buying food from, or whatever, are complicit in the occupation, or the apartheid or genocide or any sort of, you know, crimes against humanity like that. And it's really cool. You just, like, you know, we did this ourselves. We, you know, took our groceries home, we scanned everything. I was like, oh, all right, well, I guess we need to move these three things off our shopping list, and we can buy alternatives. And we scanned the alternatives, and they were clean. So great. So that's boycott. But we have a number of different boycotting things. We have one coming up that's boycott in your bank account. So same thing, but instead of scanning your groceries, you connect it to your bank account, to your credit card, and you see, you know, what on your credit card is supporting, you know, unethical companies. There's a similar thing for venture capital. It's called ethics.vc, and that is trying to hold venture capital accountable, and to apply a code of ethics, which includes humanitarian restrictions, I suppose, on what people say, what they invest in, and what venture capital says, what they invest in, and sort of rating venture capitalists. The goal being to move capital from the least ethical venture capitalists to the most ethical, or at least the more ethical. And we're working with a lot of student groups on applying this to their university campuses. We also have some, you know, simpler projects like you know, move off Spotify, because the CEO of Spotify, Daniel Ek, invested $100 million into weapons companies. So people don't want to keep using Spotify, and so we have someone creating an exporter that you can move from Spotify to something else. We also have a lot of media bias. There's newscord.org, which does, you know, sort of analysis of many different articles on the same themes, and it shows where the bias is in headlines. You know, you might not have noticed this, but once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. That, you know, the use of the passive voice. You know, children just die
all the time.
Right.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
And once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. And so this news cord is an AI that highlights, you know, this New York Times article. You know, let's compare it to an Al Jazeera article, CNN article. You know, see who is inserting bias into their process. And then we also have a project called Media Meter, which does the same thing, but it will analyze the past history of a media organization. And they work with media literacy groups, with media watchdogs, that sort of thing, to help them see when, let's say, the New York Times or someone is being extremely biased. So that's sort of, you know, a smattering of the things we have. But, you know, anything that's in the pro-Palestine space, we will take a look at. You know, we interview multiple projects a week. Interviewed 3 yesterday, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think that they have the potential to be impactful, then we will work with them.
Wow. Great set of examples, and made it much concrete for me, and I think for our listeners as well, to understand some of the outcomes. Very meaningful and great applications for using tech for good. Just as I'm kind of putting all this together, why would someone like you, who I assume grew up in the West, was very much involved in tech, as you mentioned, and was having some sort of a typical career, but a very successful one, would be any different to some of the people that you mentioned? And I want to know a little bit about a persona or an archetype of a human like you versus the humans that we spoke about. Tell me a little bit more about your thoughts on this.
There's a lot of different facets to it. I've reflected on this quite a lot. There's one obvious one, which is that I'm Irish. And I feel like a lot of Irish people know about Palestine. Somehow, I didn't. Somehow, I guess I grew up in a bunch of different places, not just Ireland, but somehow the sort of like history there evaded me. But, you do know our own history. And so Ireland is a colony, or was historically a colony of the British, our lovely neighbors. And the British committed, the same sort of atrocities as the British committed in lots of places, and that, Americans are currently committing in lots of places. And that history of being on the side of the colonized, and the people to whom these atrocities are done, sticks with you. Ireland had multiple genocides, and one that you're probably most familiar with is the Irish potato famine. Not actually a famine, an engineered famine where the British were taking all the food. And growing up, we didn't know that even in the history that we learn in school, we weren't taught, the British did this to us. We were just taught, oh, a famine happened. There weren't any potatoes. And so learning later in life that actually this was something that was done to us, and that, a very similar thing was done in Bengal, for example, in the 1940s, or the parallels to the American genocide of the Native Americans. You look at any state in America, and you look up the genocide that happened there. I was reading about the Californian genocide recently, and it's horrific, and it happens constantly, and the people to whom it happened remember, and becomes part of their cultural psyche in a sense. So Irish was one part of it. Also, my dad was a human rights diplomat, so he worked in human rights his whole career, so that was definitely part of our sort of mentality or values growing up. I think another part of it is, and this is a bit of a weird one, but I have ADHD, and I mean, lots of people do, but one of the ways that it seems to manifest for me is that I have a much more black or white view of things, and, nuances. I wouldn't say necessarily harder for me, but I actually don't believe in nuance all that much. And so, looking at something like this, it was very easy to be like, you mentioned people saying it's complicated. It's like, well, it's complicated as propaganda. It's complicated is, war crimes are never complicated. It's very straightforward to say that bombing apartment blocks is wrong, and cheering it on is wrong, and continuing to provide weapons for it is wrong, and a very deep kind of wrong as well. There was another. Oh yeah. So the other element as well, I think, is risk tolerance. Founders very often have extremely high risk tolerance, and that's why they become founders. And you need to deal with. And maybe this is especially true in a time when there was less funding. In the 2009 to 2000, I don't know, 13, 14 kind of time, there really wasn't that much funding, and so the people who were taking, who were starting startups and who were taking the risk were people who really, had this kind of high risk tolerance. And I have a pretty high risk tolerance, and plus, after your startup has succeeded, your risk tolerance goes way up. You have financial stability, and you can, basically take a punt at whatever you like. So I think all of those things combined in a way, but I think it was cemented by the sort of reception to my blog post, when not only people saying, finally someone is speaking up, but also I could see the negative responses, and they typically weren't said to me, but you could see them on Reddit, for example, or my Google search for my name brought up a lot of them. And the kind of thing that people were saying is, it's so, so clearly biased, so one-sided, but also, it was clear that there's a lot of people who were definitively and purposefully supporting the genocidalists. And often they were Israeli, or they were, sort of like the US right wing. And so, they really had this, this purpose of supporting what was happening. And that was, that was something that you see that and you're like, oh, there's actual, forces for evil in the world. And they are working to make the genocide happen, and shades of the Holocaust, obviously there, and so I think there was a very strong, well, we are now the people in this position, so this is our job now.
You said it's because you're Irish, and makes tons of sense. I mean, you don't have a strong accent, but I did see, given your education and so on, I already thought that may have played a factor, because very much all of my Irish friends, including the ones listening, are pro-Palestine. And I mean, your dad's profession and focus, the ADHD part being very much, clear on what's right or what's wrong. And it's kind of very definitive. The one that I kind of wanted to probe in a little bit on was the risk tolerance, because the argument might be, well, by doing this, you're actually taking a lot of risk, risking your success as a founder, your reputation for some. How do you really answer that question? What were you thinking? Even if you're against all this genocide, why would you speak up about it? Just let it be. You're not yourself affected. Obviously, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but you're not yourself affected by this. Why bother? Why speak up, Paul?
So when I say risk tolerance, I mean extremely tolerant of risk. So if there's something that could go wrong from this, I'm not really thinking about it. It doesn't really factor into my thinking. So what factors into my thinking is, why is this important? Why is this interesting? And I think it was pretty clear, certainly in December, that this was a genocide, that was being committed by the US, and that tech and a lot of the people around me were heavily involved, and also to a certain extent that no one else was really working on the problem. So I mean, I don't really know what other options there were. In a sense, I'm the one who's here. I'm the one who's doing it, so I should keep doing that.
That's inspiring. Thank you, Paul. We're going to take a short break, and when we're back, I'd love to hear from you more on using tech for good. Hey there, my amazing product people. If you're trying to find your own story with product, design, and leadership, gain a new perspective on being human in a soulless corporate world, and possibly have a good laugh in the process, you can grab your very own copy of my latest book, Product People, A Journal of Laughter and Tears. It's available on Amazon in all formats right now. Happy reading. All right, let's continue where we left off. I wanted to speak to you more about some positive examples of tech being used for good. Now, you mentioned some of the projects that you're supporting through Tech for Palestine. I'd love to know more of these stories and more of these examples. Mostly, my angle is that I want to separate tech as a means from the people running it. And I think through some of these stories, we can create that hope and way for people to think of tech as a way to create positive impact.
Most projects that we work with are projects that were started before we got to them. We've also been starting a number of projects ourselves, but it's mostly someone had an idea and they looked to start building something to help. And it's very similar to the genesis of any startup. You see something that you want to do to help. You see something that you want to build. You see something that an area that no one is working on, or where there's limited things being done, and you think, I know something that could help here. That's primarily who we work with, and some of it, it looks again very similar to startups. Like, sometimes it's a tech person, an engineer. They're building some sort of like software project, some hosted project or an app or something in some way to help. And in some cases, it's more sort of your business founder, which in this case is a little bit more the activist founder, who has identified an area where tech could really make a difference. And so they've decided to build that, and then we're working with them to sort of to bring them in and bring the tech resources to them and that kind of thing. One that I really like is, it's a project called Jaywalk. And Jaywalk, this isn't fully built yet, but it came in. The idea was sort of a ways for protests. So when you go to a protest, often people don't know what's happening at the protest. They're often new at the protest, and they don't know that there's legal aid, or that there's medics, or that there's people giving out water. They don't know where the protest is going or what the route is. Often they don't know what chants are being said, any of this sort of thing. And so the idea of Jaywalk is providing an app for that, so that people can see where is it going, and sort of participate more, maybe increase the retention for organizers of protests. And I think it's really one of those ideas where it's not really clear where it's going to go. Like you kind of think like, oh, it's an app for protests, and maybe maybe it's a ways for protests. So you can see kind of like, all right, I can think what that would look like as the early version. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this one develops and kind of what direction they go with it. The organizers of that, they were peace activists, and I believe the organizer has like a master's in peace studies, and so they were very much like not familiar with the tech world, but had really good connections in the activist space and the organizer space, and had been going to protests for years and years. So it's a real kind of like subject matter expert coming in to build an app or an automation for a thing that they understand deeply.
On that, two questions kind of come to mind. One is, let's talk about protests for a second. I think there is different kind of mental models or ways people think about protests, especially when you think about the US, how complicit they are in what's going on. What do you think about the argument around protests don't really work? We're not really creating impact. It's a two-party system in place. The system is flawed, and both running candidates are one way or the other supporting this genocide. So what difference would a protest make? I want to hear your thoughts. The impact of protests, and overall, how do you see we can create change and help Palestinians that are being slaughtered every second today, and understand our role in hopefully making this stop?
Well, so I guess the first thing to say is that just because they haven't had the effect that was intended doesn't mean that they can't work, or that it was necessarily a bad idea for it. So protests have significantly worked in the past, which is one of the reasons that the US is like very ready for protests these days. The NYPD has, for example, has significant training in reducing protests and stopping protests, in lowering the impact of protests. But all the same, the protests have been extremely effective in bringing the issue onto the map. I agree that it didn't manage to change the Biden or the Harris campaign, which I think is a tragedy and is absolutely disgusting for both the Democratic Party and for a huge indictment of America's two-party system as a whole. But protests didn't cause that, and they're working within the framework that they have. Protests, they're very hard to prevent protests. So there are things that you can spin up and can get and do get people's voices out there. They become part of the narrative that this is happening, and then they create a situation where the other side of the narrative, which is, in this case is Israel, and it's sort of like the Israel lobby, APAC and ADL, for example, and the very sort of loud thought leaders, including folks in tech, who are sort of like weaponizing the protests to say, oh, this is actually anti-Semitic or whatever. But so just because the protests didn't manage to achieve what they wanted them to achieve, doesn't mean that people should stay at home. And the protests, to my mind, they definitely have had impact. Not every protest is valuable. Not every protest has an impact. Some are counterproductive in various ways. But fundamentally, people on the streets is a valuable way of showing to society that people care about an issue. It doesn't change something. It's not like a violent revolution kind of thing, but it is showing people that this is an issue worth talking about, and its purpose is not to cause change. Its purpose is to put it on the map, and then there are many other avenues by which the change is specifically made. If you look at protests that have been quite successful in the past, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests, they ended up being counterproductive, or ended up being weaponized to damage the Black Lives Matter movement. But in that moment, they provided a lot of support for people who were social justice minded, who wanted things like prison reform, police reform. They provided the backdrop by which those changes could be made. And in a lot of places, significant changes were made as a result, or at least as a result of the things that people were able to do because of the Black Lives Matter protests.
I agree. I think surfacing the issue and raising awareness is a primary goal. And I did see in a number of instances a positive result, positive impact, whether it's divesting from certain companies or investments or stopping some academic collaboration. So I think there are some really good examples of impact.
The thing to remember about this is that the movement basically started in October last year. The movement was, I wouldn't say dead, but it was dormant, it was weak, and so the whole thing is building from scratch. And the protest might be the most visible manifestation of it, but last November this wasn't really in the news, right? We could see it on social media, but it wasn't being discussed heavily. It wasn't part of the zeitgeist that this was happening and that we were complicit in. And that has happened. Now all around the world, people are against it. It's only in the United States that people are, continue to be for it. And that's various reasons, but those things are being fought against now. And so there is a really wide coalition that is working on all the different facets. For example, boycotting or divestment. And all of those parts of the movement are still really young. They are still developing, becoming stronger. And so the protests that we're looking at now are a fraction of the protests that we hope to see in a year. The boycotting that's happening now is a fraction of where we should be in a year from now. Ultimately, what a lot of people have realized is that there's no, and we're getting a little political here, but there was the Oslo Accords which was supposed to bring peace to the Middle East, and it didn't. And what people looking at that realize is that the reason it didn't is because Israel is a genocidal state that is deliberately trying to kill all the Palestinians and deliberately trying to take the land. And so you can't actually stop the bloodshed and stop the genocide that's happening without dismantling the state of Israel and the US's support for it. And so we're not in a place where we're trying to get a ceasefire. We're in a place where we actually need to ensure that the state of Israel does not have the ability to enact a genocide again. And that's ending settlements, ending apartheid, a state for Palestine, or the ideal that everyone has is a one multi-ethnic democracy in the land that is currently Palestine and Israel, although people are not optimistic for that at the moment. But the longer that the US participates in it, the more the scope grows, right? Because we've been discussing the two-party system, right? Something is happening 5,000 miles away, and here we are discussing the flaws in America and how America actually needs to be fixed. So the longer America participates in this thing, the broader the scope gets to actually, do we need to take down the system of the government system in America? Do we need to end the Israel lobby? Do we need to end the role of billionaires in our society? And it gets further and further. I see people all the time talking about how the very system of capitalism that exists in America is the cause. And honestly, I fully believe that. And I'm not sure if that the growth of what we do is ever going to reach that. But the more that it becomes part of it, the more likely that is.
In general, some people say it's all about this date, October 7th, and, ignoring all the history. But what I'm seeing is, since what happened last year, there is this moral awakening, or at least questioning, that is going on in the West in general. I think a lot of people are going through this, looking at videos, looking at social media, and I think we're seeing it a lot. And I think it's changing the perspective of a lot of people that lived in the West and, maybe had a certain perception of, okay, there's a group of people over there, having a problem with something. We don't need to worry about it. And then it's making them reflect internally around, what are my values? What is the purpose of my life? What's going on here? Have I been taken advantage of? Is this right? Where do I get my objective morality from? So it's asking a lot of questions, and I'm seeing this renewed awakening in the West, or reflection, which I think is very positive, and it's changing a lot of people's mind when they're faced with a lot of these facts. But with that comes a major challenge, which I think we can connect to your points earlier, and that is the problem of censorship. What do we do to make our voices heard when we know that there's some words, there's some ways, there's some groups, there's some terms that when used, you're faced with all kinds of repercussions and consequences. So I guess my question is, how do you deal with the problem of censorship, given that a lot of these platforms are controlled by the very same people that are pro-genocide?
So I think the censorship, like other parts of Israeli influence, are a real awakening or a sort of a radicalizing moment for people. When you realize, like you said, that posting something about a genocide gets your accounts shut down, or algorithmically suppressed, is a real awakening. But a lot of people are seeing that awakening without even, taking part in that. So say, for example, the TikTok ban, right? This was something that Congress put together overnight, was a blatant, and it was admitted publicly, that this was something that was blatantly targeting TikTok because of Palestine. And it was very clear that that Congress in both parties came together to shut down the free speech of young people. And that is a radicalizing moment. And realizing that Congress, which, for my entire time in the US, for most people their entire lives, hasn't done anything to help people, has been completely deadlocked, can't put major legislation forward, never work together, just, the most toxic place, that they can come together overnight to actually shut down people's voices is a radicalizing moment. And I think we see this across the space. The reason we see it is because there is a conservative movement. Israel calls it Hasbra, which is basically propaganda. And Israel uses that propaganda across the ecosystem. We talked earlier about passive voice in media. That happens because there's a lot of people who work at these media organizations who are pro-Zionist, or who are pro-Israel, and who want to shut down or who want to tell a narrative, and who are really putting the narrative in front of us. The same thing is happening at social media companies. So even TikTok was actually, did a lot of censorship of Palestinian content. It was just that there was so much that they couldn't hold it back. But on Instagram, they've done a much better job. And part of the reason for this is that the people who make these policies are directly working for Israel. So there was an expose recently on Jordana Cutler, who is basically the Israeli government official, at Meta, and who self describes as being Israel's voice in Meta. And no other country has this. Mostly regions have a policy director like this. For example, the Southeast Asia region, which is 700 million people, has one director, and Israel, a country of less than 10 million people, has the same thing. You also see the CISO of Meta, the Chief Information Security Officer, was in the IDF, the Israeli military, was in Unit 8200, which is their, sort of the Israeli NSA. And that is the person who is making these kind of policy decisions. And then you see the COO of Meta, or the former COO of Meta, the person who ran Meta for 13 years, Sheryl Sandberg, who really built Meta from being Facebook 2009 to the behemoth it is today. Today what she does is she is putting out propaganda movies for Israel, dehumanizing movies that intend to dehumanize Palestinians and make the justification for the war. So that these are the leaders of Meta. And people are looking at this and they're saying, is all of American society controlled by Israel? And everywhere you look, there's something where Israel has control. And one of the ones that really shocks people, I think, is the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, because we're used to seeing this as someone who's speaking out against the far right, but what they actually are is a pro-Israel organizer, and they very explicitly use guidelines that call criticism of Israel anti-Semitic. They talk about huge rise of anti-Semitism, but they're actually referring to huge rise of criticism of Israel or of support for Palestinian liberation. That is things that they term as anti-Semitic. And they are a partner who works with every single tech company in America. And the CEO of it, Jonathan Greenblatt, brags about this. There's multiple times he's on podcasts or giving interviews where he talks about working with everyone from Amazon to Zillow. And so it is very literally true that there are pro-Israel organizations that are deciding the policies and the speech that you can have in America. And it's happening in Congress, it's happening in media, it's happening in social media. And as people learn about this, it is very much a radicalizing moment to realize that your free speech in America is being controlled by a country 5,000 miles away whose main purpose is to take all of the land from the people who were there before they settled it 75 years ago. So it's this really sort of absurd situation that we're finding ourselves in. And then, that's what we experience as users of these software, as sort of like Gen Pop. When you're working for one of these tech companies, what you realize is that you're actually surrounded by people who used to be in the Israeli NSA, this Unit 8200, who were
Mm.
in the IDF, who were taking part in the apartheid system before the genocide started, or in many cases, Facebook pays full salary for reservists. And there's recently came out that Microsoft was
Mhm.
an employee who was taking part in the genocide in Gaza. And these are the people sort of making decisions within the tech companies, and the people who, like at Google, there's 50 people fired at Google for speaking up against Google's involvement in the genocide. Same thing is happening at Microsoft. Same thing happened at Apple. People are being fired for speaking up against the genocide, while people who literally actively participate in it are kept on. So, I think it's hard to see all of this without it becoming something that fully changes you. And this is one of the reasons I advocate so hard for just telling people about what's happening, because just the facts itself, whether it's Israel's influence in America, or whether it's the genocide that's happening in Gaza and the US's support for it, it is a one-way system. People learn about it and they don't go back.
So, in your mind, on this element of censorship, if you're someone out there, whether you work for one of these tech giants, but also corporations that are very much pro-Israel, and they have Zionist policies and they want to advocate for it, and you do want to voice your opinion, but at the same time there is this kind of competing forces. I try to imagine and try to apply that empathy as well for people to say, okay, well, obviously you see all these examples of when you actually speak for Palestinians, when you speak for humanity in general, when you speak about justice, when you speak about anything that is outside that norm, outside that narrative, you get all kinds of things that you mentioned. You get the online platforms working against you. You get your employer potentially giving you a warning and maybe letting you go, firing you, and so on. So the question that I want to get your thoughts on is, there's a two-part problem here. One is, how do you get your voice heard when these platforms are very much controlled by the same people that are supporting this Zionist state? So that's part of the question. And then the second part is, how do you reason through this as an individual? Assume you're an engineer working at a tech company and you're thinking, my livelihood, my salary, my mortgage, my everything, my life, I can't really risk all of that because I'm scared. So how do you tackle these two things? Dealing with that censorship to be heard, but also understanding and going through this maybe mental and psychological predicament in a way, or process of trying to make the right decision for you on both the short term and the long term. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think that people have come around to this idea that social media is the thing that you have to do. That in order to be heard on a topic, you have to say something on social media, and that social media is an effective way to do something. And I think we're seeing in this case that neither of those are true. People aren't convinced by posts on social media because they're short. And it takes time, it takes energy to really get someone to see what's happening out there. And obviously social media is suppressed. The same thing is happening in tech companies. And most companies, speaking up for Palestine is forbidden inside most tech companies. Google even bans the word genocide internally. Meta doesn't allow anyone to say anything internally. Microsoft fires people for speaking up. So the idea that the only way to make an impact is to say something to everyone who works at Microsoft or Meta or whatever. I don't think that that's the only way. I think the way to bring people over is to talk to them one at a time. What our movement has in its advantage is, one, that it is very distributed. People everywhere know what is wrong. There's people all over the place who understand the problem, who know the history, and also that it is something which is morally right. So anyone who learns about the genocide, if they're not an intrinsically evil person, then they understand that genocide is wrong. Killing people is wrong. Killing civilians is wrong. So those those two things, tell me that what we should be doing is telling people individually. We should be telling people offline, about what's happening, educating them, telling them the history, telling them about the suppression, telling them about what's happening in their company. And I think that, as we see the suppression, so for example, 50 people being fired at Google, where does that leave you? Well, it leaves you that one-on-one advocacy, things that don't, make as much noise, that aren't so perceived as protests, and that are literally just, one person telling another person. And that's true, at work, but it's also true in society, right? You have a bunch of friends. Do your friends know? Probably your friends don't know as much as you. So start telling them. And if they have questions that you don't know the answers to, well, that's education for you as well. But each of us can tell 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 people without needing social media as a microphone. And indeed, I would claim that social media is an ineffective microphone for people who aren't, sort of extremely online. There's 80% of America that needs to be told about what's happening, and they're not getting their news from social media in the same way that we are. So, those are the people we need to bring the news to. I feel that social media has been a real crutch in advocacy, and that, it really only lets us talk to ourselves, and that the next move that the whole movement needs to make is reaching out. And I think this is true of things like protests as well. We reach the same people again and again. Now it's time to take the people in the movement that we've built up and bring that, by word of mouth.
I think that's a very interesting angle. There's also that, it's kind of a hidden silver lining, and I don't know if you would agree to this, but a lot of that Hasbara propaganda that you mentioned, I think is doing the work for the Palestinian cause, to be honest, because of how do I say it? I mean, there's no other way and other than maybe saying how stupid it is and how ineffective, in my opinion, it's become. I mean, I see so many examples of this where they're trying so hard, but it's very clear, it's very blatant, and people can see through it because it's very ridiculous. Like, I think the most recent example, the videos that they took as part of one of their operations, which according to a lot of sources was a coincidental or typical operation where they killed, his nickname is Abu Ibrahim, they killed a leader of the resistance, and thinking that, we did an amazing job. The world is going to love it. We're defeating the Palestinians. Of course, the relabeling of things happens all the time. They don't want you to say Palestinians. They want you to say the H group. To your point, they don't want you, anytime you speak for Palestinian rights, you're labeled anti-Semitic. And, a lot of it is what do they call it? The NPC talking points. It's the same points. It's the same kind of talking points that are repeated over and over again. But I see so many of these examples where even early on, all these fake stories that they made up about October 7th, not even fact-checked, how they came out to be wrong just because of where the narrative was falling apart. And we see how, in a way, how aggressive and how, you said evil. I think evil is the right word. I don't know, again, if you saw this, but like this interview recently, I think it was a CNN with Mehdi Hassan and the other, can't even remember his name, and I don't want to, but that other guest making a comment about beepers and his beeper going off. So I don't know if it's a silver lining or it's just becoming more clear, or is it intentional stupidity on their side that they're ridiculing themselves? And I think they're getting to a stage to not caring. You wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's important to remember that at this point, being on Team Israel, you have to be deep in the rabbit hole, right? It's a fully closed system of people repeating these dehumanizing statements about Palestinians that you start to believe them, and you start to believe that everyone believes the same thing as you do. And so when you create, this like very weird narrative of like the UN is Hamas, for example, right? Just an absurd concept. And you say that to someone isn't going to say, "Oh, interesting, is the UN Hamas?" They're going to say, "What the hell are you talking about? That's crazy. Oh, the Red Cross is Hamas. And very
The
often they
students on campuses in the U.S. That was another. I remember when there was a lot of protesting happening in, I think it was in Colombia. That was
yeah.
the same level.
And it's gotten to the point that it used to be that if you called someone anti-Semitic, that was the end of their career. Now you call someone anti-Semitic, it's like, well, I wonder what they're talking about here. And then you go and you look up their statements, and is it they're saying something horrible about Jewish people, which would of course be anti-Semitic? And it's like, oh no, they said from the river to the sea. They said a slogan for Palestinian freedom. They said Israel doesn't have the right to exist, which I think is a confusing phrasing of the statement they're trying to say, but not the genocidal thing that pro-Israel people try to label it as. And I think in particular all the stuff we've been talking about, where they do these overt things like shutting down TikTok, or suppressing Palestinian content, it gets out. And the thing is, people aren't stupid, right? I know that propaganda movements can deeply affect people, but as individual people are not remotely as stupid as Israel wants them to be, or the US decision makers want them to be. And so when you tell them something like there's beheaded babies, and they have this like visceral reaction, oh my God, they beheaded babies, and then they learn they were lied to, that has a visceral reaction in the opposite direction. They like, oh, I'm being lied to. I was made feel like a fool. They took me as a fool. I need to learn more about this. And they become radicalized in the opposite direction. And what you see on Team Palestine, let's call it, it's very, very kind of similar to the progressive left. It's very focused on not exaggerating things, very focused on like staying extremely on message, and to a fault. A lot of time it's a little self-destructive for the movement, but it's it's kind of intrinsic to what is. And there is no there is no idea that like, oh, Hamas tricked me into believing that Palestinians are people. The core concepts of it are pro-humanity, pro-liberty, pro-freedom, pro-equality, pro-human rights, and those are things that are core to most people's values. And there's no oh, I was tricked into thinking that human rights were a good thing. I feel so stupid. But there is that on with what Israel is putting out, and in particular this anti-Semitism thing. There's only so many times that you're told, oh, this person was anti-Semitic, this person's anti-Semitic, AOC is anti-Semitic, the British Labour Party is anti-Semitic. And it worked for the British Labour Party, right? It destroyed the British Labour Party and replaced it with pro-Israel people. But it can only work so many times before people start seeing, and obviously we're seeing this already, oh, that's funny. I looked at what that person said, and they were criticizing a genocide. Like, what's the connection here? And you investigate the connection, and it's like, oh, this is a deliberate movement trying to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And the people who are doing it are the people who, the Anti-Defamation League, the people that we thought were against defamation. It's actually a pro-Israel movement.
Oh, absolutely. Where do I go from here? Wow. I think one of the things that I'm also seeing is by time is changing, where we used to be on the back foot in a way. And these points, whether it's do you condemn something, enter something here. Israel has a right to defend itself. That's another very common one. We're the only democracy. We're the most, what's the other one? The most moral army that exists. That's another ridiculous claim to make. But I wanted to get your thoughts. I mean, you have a connection with Europe as well. So, I mean, we talked a lot about the US and what's going on, whether it's the tech scene in Europe and what's going on. We see these reactions, especially from, let's say, countries like Germany, but also the UK, about their support. The level of aggression, for example, of bringing down the protesters in countries like Germany, we've seen a lot of that. And I think the attacks, do take different levels. We've seen right out aggression, even, physical aggression, verbal aggression in some cases, like the examples we gave earlier. We've seen it in the US, but we've also seen it in Europe. So, and then we've seen some more subtle kind of implied things like, oh, these students are never going to find a job in the future, or things like that. But do you think that, I kind of feel weird asking this question because I'm talking about colonizing powers, and I'm asking you about how do they feel, or how their governments should feel about another colonizing state that still exists. But do you see things any different in Europe, whether from a tech perspective or from an advocacy perspective?
So, I think the major thing is that the US is involved in a way that Europe isn't. For example, in the UN votes to stop Israel, the US was the sole holdout. The other members of the Security Council voted to do something. The US is obviously also supplying the weapons. So the war pretty much ends as soon as Biden or Biden's successor says so. And that's something that has happened historically. Reagan stopped previous things. Even Biden, in 2021, Biden was the one who stopped what Israel was doing. So it is very much that the US has a special place because the US is funding not just the genocide, by specifically I mean funding the bombs that are being dropped on Palestinians and that are committing the genocide, but the US is supporting it politically, but also most of the economic support for Israel also comes from the US. And that's in one sense a political thing in the US, but also you look at who's funding settlements. That money is coming from rich people in the US. So the entire state of Israel is relying on the US. And so countries in Europe, don't have the same, they have some complicity, and obviously there's the whole Holocaust thing that most of Europe is complicit in, and
Mhm.
that led to the Zionist movement in a way. I said in a way pretty directly. So there is an awful lot of complicity there, but what's happening today is 1000% the US's support, and the people in Europe are a lot more attuned to what is happening. They're a lot less susceptible to US media. Like I think we don't really understand in America how limited the range of opinions that we hear is. In Europe, they hear far more, let's call it real news. Sean King recently posted online that he had been in Ireland, and half the things he heard on the radio were about Gaza, which is unheard of in America, right? And this is the number one thing that's happening in the world right now. And in America, the media treats it as something on the side, and that's a very deliberate choice they make, because that's part of part of how it's decided what to tell us. You pick a couple of things to focus on, and you make them, you make it crazy, and then you sort of like limit the range of opinions that they see on other things, or limit the range of American problems that are shown to us. So that doesn't happen as much in Europe, and they have a much broader knowledge about what's happening. But then you run into specific things in specific places, like Germany, for example, which is extremely
Mhm.
pro-Israel. Obviously, it has its own history of the Holocaust that it appears to have learned the wrong lessons from, and as a result, they're participating in another one.
Mhm. Yes. All right. So thinking about an individual out there who's listening to us, someone that is perhaps grappling with the current state of the world. They're feeling
Mm,
overwhelmed by a lot of these man-made injustices, especially if they live in North America, the high cost of living, financial constraints.
mhm.
As someone that they, I'd say, look up to and think of as a great example and an inspiration, and someone that they can learn from, someone like you, what advice would you offer them to help them navigate these challenges?
The number one thing I hear from people who we work with at Tech for Palestine is that it felt so much better to be part of the solution. They felt hopeless, they felt depressed, and then when they started working on it, they felt better. And obviously, when you work on it, you see the horrible things a lot more, but you also see a lot of the good things. You meet a lot of the people who are working towards it, and you feel a sense of optimism that change is coming. And, I'm not saying that change is coming soon. The Vietnam War took 7 years to end, but by deciding to become part of the solution, you allow yourself to not, to come out of the despair that you're feeling now. And so that's what I'd say to people. If you're feeling despair about the thing, join a thing, talk to, or just educate people around you. Make a list of the 50 people you know best, and go have a conversation with them and say, do you know about Palestine? Do you know what's happening? Take the education that you're getting, and make sure that other people get it too. And both of these will, whether you get involved in an existing movement, or whether you're personally going out to advocate, both of these will help you feel like you're actually part of the solution, and will help you get out of that despair that you're feeling.
I think that's great advice. Being part of the solution, coming out of that despair through action. And not only educating others, but educating yourself and advocating. Now, I want to ask you, we've been talking about the West, the US, but also the West in general. And if you could change one thing about the Western world, what would that be? And how would you go about making that change happen?
My sense is that, the thing at the core of all this is money in politics. So, Citizens United, the ability to influence policies or to buy politicians, I think is probably the number one problem that is the cause of all of the other problems. I think we could go a little bit deeper and talk about decolonization or something like that, but it's a little abstract. And so one specific change I would make is remove money from politics. I think it's hard to say how that can happen. Probably it's going to take a constitutional amendment, which are almost impossible in America. But my sense is that, we'll see this on, what is it, Tuesday, that the election is happening. We may find ourselves in a massively changed political situation overnight, and the aftermath of that may lead to this kind of change.
I see. Definitely a deeper topic. All right. How can those interested in your work, all the great things that you spoke about, the projects, how might they connect with you?
On techforpalestine.org, there's a Get Involved page, and you can apply to create a project as part of the incubator, or you can get involved as a volunteer and get plugged into some of these projects and participate in this kind of work.
Awesome. All right, Paul, this conversation was inspiring, meaningful, and authentic. And I want to say thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the Product People podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
To Paul Biggar, I want to say thank you for your courage, advocacy, and the impact you're creating through Tech for Palestine. I want to express my gratitude to all our listeners. Your support means the world to me. If you found today's episode valuable, please hit subscribe, leave a review, or share this podcast with your friends. I also encourage you to share your feedback and your ideas on what topics you'd like to hear about next on this podcast. Your input is very important as it helps me learn and improve. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes, and until next time, stay courageous, creative, and compassionate. Take care.